December 16th, 1944, south of the Hurtgen Forest. 05:41 hours, overcast. Visibility, 70 meters. Colonel Dietrich Klempt stood at the edge of a muddy road, boot soles sinking into the frost-hardened slush. A cigarette trembled between his fingers, its ember glowing dull against the morning fog. Behind him, a dozen engineers laid the final charges beneath the last felled pine, the one blocking Route L-47, the artery needed for the Panzer column to advance by dawn. He squinted upward into the gray. No sound, no movement. Only silence, broken by the occasional crack of trees thawing. "Relax," he muttered, more to himself than the staff officer beside him. "They won't fly in this filth. Americans can't even find their way to a latrine without blue skies." The lieutenant nodded, boots pristine, clipboard tight to his chest. "Luftwaffe reports the same. Fog stretches 20 clicks. No air threat. None." Dietrich exhaled hard through his nose and stepped toward the tree line. The smoke from his cigarette hung unnaturally in the air, then twisted sideways. A breeze? No. He paused, narrowed his eyes. The wind wasn't moving the smoke. Something else was. Behind the fog. A low growl, steady, deliberate, mechanical. Suddenly, a ripple of white swept through the treetops, not from snow, but from above. It hissed, it sizzled. Then, a curtain of smoke dropped across the valley like a theater stage closing mid-act. "Was ist das?" someone yelled. Dietrich turned sharply. The cigarette dropped from his mouth, smothered in slush. Above them, unseen, unauthorized, and impossibly low, a lone American fighter banked hard over the ridge, wings loaded with smoke pods, not bombs. One man, no clearance, no escort, no warning. And yet, in less than 60 seconds, he would erase the eyes of an entire German division. Dietrich didn't know it yet, but this fog wasn't nature. It was deliberate. 3 days earlier, December 13th, 1944, west of Düren, the snow had just started falling again. Thin, fluttering flakes danced across the cracked windshield of a parked Kübelwagen as General Lieutenant Franz Bayer lit a cigar with trembling hands. He didn't tremble from cold, but from anticipation. Finally, after weeks of stagnation, the German High Command was moving again. And they would strike not with finesse, but with mass. The plan was elegant. Field Marshal Model's forces would punch through the Ardennes and seize Antwerp. The Americans would be caught off guard, isolated, cut to pieces. The fog was their ally. The panzers were ready. And this miserable weather, the same frostbite that rotted toes and seized engine blocks, would also ground the Allied Air Force. "No eyes," Bayer had said to his officers that morning, jabbing a knife into the paper map. "No mercy." They called it Watch on the Rhine. It was the last great gamble of Hitler's Reich, and Franz Bayer was ready to roll the dice. He glanced at his watch, 14:08 hours. Beneath his command, over 14,000 men, engineers, mechanized infantry, and over 180 armored vehicles had been repositioned in total silence, shielded by the clouds. The Americans had no idea, and in that sliver of ignorance, Bayer placed his faith. At a temporary command post near Wassenack, Hauptmann Klempt stared at a grid map. The sector was divided into fire zones, overlapping kill fields for American artillery. But for the past 48 hours, those guns had been strangely silent. Too silent. Even the forward observers noted the change. No shelling, no probing raids, no recon patrols. Just fog. Thick, sticky, relentless fog. "This is a gift," Klempt had muttered. "Their spotters are blind. We move now. We move clean." They began staging for a night push. Trucks idled beneath tarps. Fuel cans were stacked neatly behind camouflaged hedgerows. Panthers were warmed, oil systems checked, tracks cleaned of ice. The 26th Volks Grenadier Division readied to punch west along the forest route, if the smoke stayed thick. And all signs said it would. The Americans, for their part, were stalled. Across the line, units of the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions had dug into foxholes, most knee-deep in water. The terrain was a mess. Roads were craters. Mules carried more supplies than trucks. A private with frostbite was more likely than one with a fresh pair of socks. And above them, nothing. No air support. No reconnaissance. No weather break. Every pilot at the forward airfields near Spa and Liège had been grounded for 5 days. Even the P-47 Thunderbolt squadrons were idle, wings sheathed in snow, engines choked with cold start vapor. Inside a briefing tent of the 306th Fighter Group, Captain Lyle D. Mason stared at a handwritten weather report. He didn't like the tone. Visibility, 0. Ceiling, nil. Operations, suspended. He flipped the page. Some fool had scribbled a note on the bottom in pencil. "Unless you're insane?" Mason chuckled dryly. His crew chief, seated across from him, just shook his head. "We fly blind. We die fast." But Mason wasn't listening. He was staring at another paper, the sketch of a ridge, drawn in charcoal, with marked elevations and wind corridors. He knew that valley, and he knew what the Germans were preparing there. "Smoke's not always your enemy," he murmured. "Sometimes it's your stage." Back at the German CP, Colonel Klemp stood with arms folded. "The Americans rely on coordination," he told his staff. "They synchronize artillery, air cover, armor. But if you blind them, you sever the nerve." He smiled thinly. "And we've blinded them." He had no way of knowing. At that exact moment, 14 kilometers east, one American pilot was checking his fuel levels. No orders, no approval, just one plane. And 2 pods of white phosphorus smoke canisters, pulled from the flare inventory by mistake. Or maybe fate. December 16th, 1944, or 5:22 a.m. The Hurtgen Valley, West Slope. The wind picked up again, but this time it came with sound. Not the thud of boots or the whine of half-tracks, but a low, persistent rumble, almost like thunder with a rhythm. It rolled down the tree line in waves. The 1st German infantry unit to notice it was the 2nd Platoon, Grenadier Regiment 983. They were hauling signal wire through the woods when one of them stopped and pointed upward. "Was ist das?" They looked up. Nothing. Only sky choked with fog. But the sound didn't stop. It was moving. Fast. Hauptfeld Webel Meissner, the platoon sergeant, adjusted his headset. Still no contact with battalion HQ. Radio signals were patchy, likely jammed by terrain, but something felt wrong. He tapped his corporal. "Check the wire. We may have crossed frequencies." And log that sound. Then it happened. A sudden flash of white above the tree line. Not explosive, not fiery, but thick and blooming, smoke, descending in arcs, whistling softly. 1, 2, 4 shells, then 12. White phosphorus. The first canister burst above a frozen creek bed, blooming outward like a ghost made of chalk. It didn't burn. It erased. The entire western approach was swallowed in an instant. Meissner dropped his headset. "What in God's name?" A kilometer east, Colonel Klempt felt the shift. He stepped out of his command post and squinted into the woods. The road, which had been visible moments ago, was now shrouded in roiling clouds of smoke. Not artillery fire, not mortars, no sound of shells, no whistling, just arrival, a chemical curtain descending over an entire division. "Who gave the order to deploy smoke?" he snapped. No one answered, because no one had. Inside the fog, everything slowed. Orders couldn't be shouted. Units couldn't be seen. One tank crew panicked and reversed into a ditch. Another fired blind toward a movement they couldn't confirm. And above it all, they still heard the engine, that one droning hum, that ghost in the clouds. Somewhere, someone had eyes, someone who could see through the blindness. And he was watching them. Far above, Lieutenant Lyle Mason looped his P-47 Thunderbolt and pulled hard on the stick. The air was rough. The instruments fogged, but he had timed it perfectly. The smoke had dropped right on the center of the German motor pool. No explosions, no casualties, just confusion. He glanced at the next switch. More smoke. He hit it. A second pass. Another volley. As he banked left, he caught a flash below. 2 Panzer crews out of their hatches, yelling into radios, trying to find orders in a world turned white. He smiled grimly. They weren't blind because of weather. They were blind because he'd made them blind. And this was only the beginning. Or 5:48. AM, western ridge of the Hurtgen approach. The fog was no longer fog. It moved too fast, shifted too deliberately. One moment it hung like mist over the road. The next it curled and licked through the tree trunks like a living thing. White phosphorus didn't just obscure vision, it devoured it. Made shadows turn traitor. Made light itself feel like a lie. And in the center of that confusion, a German convoy halted. 12 tanks, 30 trucks. 4 half-tracks loaded with ammunition and winter fuel. All of it stopped, because no one could see, because no one knew where the road went, because a single American pilot had jammed their entire operation, without firing a single bullet. Captain Jürgen Stahl, logistics officer of the 26th Volksgrenadier, screamed into his radio, "Clear the damn road! Use flares! Use anything!" The reply came back broken. "Visibility 0. Second column rear-ended. We have wounded." Stahl slammed his fist against the metal side of the command truck. He stepped out into the haze and instantly vanished. To his men, it looked like he was swallowed whole. At the edge of the tree line, a young German radio man wiped his goggles and saw nothing but smoke. He had grown up believing war was glorious, that it came with flags and horns, and destiny. But here, in this gray, muffled, choking whiteness, he saw none of that. Just silhouettes stumbling, orders shouted in every direction, panic that started quietly, then spread like fire. Then, somewhere in the distance, the sound of engines, but not German, throaty, growling, rhythmic, Sherman tanks coming fast from the flank. Inside the 2nd Battalion of the 99th Infantry Division, Captain Harold James checked his watch. "Now," he said. 2 platoons surged forward through a side ravine. One Mason had marked with smoke on his second pass. What the Germans thought was concealment was a signal. An arrow. They took it. They moved, right into the exposed right side of the paralyzed convoy. Gunfire opened in bursts. Short, precise. Not a massacre. Not yet. But enough. German crews scrambled to rotate turrets, but couldn't get line of sight. Artillery officers yelled for coordinates, but couldn't see the trees, let alone the enemy. And one by one, the tanks began to stall. Not from hits, but from hesitation. They couldn't move. They couldn't shoot. They couldn't breathe. Up above, Mason watched the third pod drop, the last of his smoke payload. He had no more tricks, but he didn't need them. Not now. The German division wasn't destroyed. It was disoriented. And in war, sometimes that was enough. He pulled the throttle and began his final loop. Below, like ants in spilled sugar, the enemy scrambled in all directions. Still no AA fire, still no coordination, still blind. And that's when the silence broke. Not with explosions, but with something worse. Radios went dark. The German signal corps had overloaded the net. Every channel screamed at once. Then, nothing. Just static. A single lieutenant in the rear finally understood. He whispered to no one, "We're not in a battle. We're in a trap." 06:10 a.m., near the frozen stream, southeast of the wrecked convoy. Colonel Klempt stumbled through the smoke, cloth pressed over his mouth. The sting of phosphorus bit his lungs, and every breath tasted like chalk and gasoline. His overcoat, once immaculate, was smeared with mud, frost, and soot. He wasn't looking for victory now. He was looking for answers. The convoy was gone. Not destroyed, vanished in a white void. Trucks overturned, tanks silent, and the radios dead. He knelt beside a crater, not deep enough for a bomb, just a divot in the frost-covered road. At the center was a scorched ring. No shrapnel, no fire damage, just heat and white residue. Klempt reached down and picked up what remained. A warped, half-melted fragment of aluminum stamped with foreign letters. U.S. Army Air Forces Smoke Dispersal, M8, Defied. His gloved hand tightened. This wasn't artillery. It wasn't random. This was aerial, deliberate. A low, quiet voice behind him, Lieutenant Meissner, face pale with soot. "Sir, the smoke wasn't defensive." Klempt turned slowly. "What?" Meissner swallowed hard. "It didn't cover retreat. It marked our position." That was when it hit him. The fog hadn't saved them. It had baited them. 30 kilometers east, inside an Allied forward command post, a young American officer smirked at a wall of red X's. "Looks like Mason found his canvas," he said. The general didn't look up. "Canvas?" "Yeah. Smoke's not just cover. It's a message. A big damn message." He tapped the map. "Message says, you were never in control." Back in the haze, Klempt dropped the canister shard. His mind flashed back to every assumption, every calculation. The artillery silence, the fog, the halting of Allied supply movements. He thought it had meant retreat. Instead, it had meant one thing: setup. The American pilot didn't blind them by chance. He blinded them on purpose. With no bombs, no napalm, no flamethrowers, just smoke. Smoke that unmade maps, shattered chains of command, and left one of Germany's most experienced divisions paralyzed, eyes wide open but blind. He sank to one knee and muttered beneath his breath, "How do you fight a ghost?" 06:22. Sector W5, eastern edge of the deployment zone. From the treetops, the snow fell in waves now, thick, heavy sheets that landed silently on helmets, barrels, and open mouths still frozen in disbelief. What the Germans had called winter's advantage was turning on them. Because in war, blindness isn't a state. It's a weapon, and they had walked straight into it. An abandoned half-track sat idling in a ravine. Its engine purred, but no one remained inside. The driver, Obergefreiter Ludwig Bauer, had fled. Not from fire, not from force, but from confusion. He had been trained for battle, not this. 1 minute, the road was there. The next, it was gone. His commander screamed to reverse, but he couldn't tell which direction was which. Snow reflected the phosphorus smoke. Tree lines shimmered and bent like illusions. Every command sounded like panic. When he finally climbed out to orient himself, he saw something he never forgot. German soldiers running in circles, not retreating, not advancing, just lost. North of the ravine, a Panther tank's turret rotated endlessly. The gunner inside, Sergeant Otto Richter, shouted coordinates to no one. His loader had vanished. His commander was down with a concussion after the tank collided with an unseen ditch. He locked the scope on a shadow moving in the smoke. Pulled the trigger. Nothing. It was a pine tree. He collapsed back into the seat, helmet shaking. The real enemy wasn't outside the armor. It was inside his head. Meanwhile, in the clouds above, Mason's canopy was frosting at the edges. Fuel was low. The gauges danced near empty. But he circled once more. He had no guns left, no rockets, no orders. But he couldn't leave yet. He needed to see it. The collapse. Not in explosions, but in posture. In the huddle of tank crews with no formation. In the shouting officers whose voices cracked like broken radios. In the units firing blind, not at Americans, but at shapes. He clicked the radio. "Command, this is Ghost Rider 1. Smoke run complete. Visual confirms total gridlock." Pause. Then a voice replied, "Roger, Ghost Rider. You did it." Another voice added, softer, "You blinded them, son." 0640. AM. German forward command tent. Klempt sat at the edge of the folding table, gloves off, steam rising from the tea he hadn't touched. A junior officer rushed in. "Sir, 8th Panzer is requesting immediate retreat clearance." "Denied," Klempt snapped. "But sir, they've lost visibility. Half their scouts are—" "Do you not understand?" Klempt barked. "There is nowhere to retreat to." The officer stood frozen. Klempt turned away, lowered his voice. "They see everything, and we see nothing." That was the turning point. Not when the tanks burned, not when the lines broke, but when the Germans stopped trusting their own eyes. And in that moment, one pilot, flying alone, against orders, had flipped the battlefield, not with bombs, but with blindness. 6 weeks earlier, November 3rd, 1944, RAF Kingsnorth, Kent, England. Lyle David Mason sat on a wooden crate inside a hangar that smelled like grease, cold coffee, and aviation fuel. His uniform was wrinkled. His flight jacket, regulation brown, hung too loose on his frame. In one hand, a wrench. In the other, a letter. The corner was stained from oil, the handwriting neat, looping. "Lyle, if you ever get the chance to fly low again, make it count." Alan, his brother, killed 2 months earlier, outside Nancy. German artillery had zeroed their position after smoke failed to mark a retreat path. Half the platoon was trapped in open ground, with no cover. Alan died buying time. Time no one used. Mason hadn't spoken much since. He wasn't insubordinate. He just changed. Flew quiet. Filed flight plans no one asked for. Spent hours sketching fog patterns, wind tunnels, and road grids in a beat-up notebook he carried in his boot. "Man's got ghosts," one mechanic muttered. But no one could argue his skill. On paper, Mason was the ideal pilot. Logged over 300 hours, near-perfect strike ratios, never missed a target. In the air, he was something else. October 28th, disciplinary hearing. Mason had flown a low recon pass over occupied terrain without clearance. The general had demanded an explanation. He gave none. Only slid his notebook across the table. Diagrams showing how wind carried smoke through ravines, how it pooled, how it lingered. The officers exchanged looks. "Mason, this isn't a bombing strategy." It's... One paused. A trap diagram, the other finished. Mason stood. No one's afraid of what they can't see. But you blind them, and they start seeing things that aren't there. The verdict: he was grounded. Officially. Unofficially? The 366th Fighter Group quietly kept him on standby. Just in case, they said. So when the call came on December 16th, a jammed grid, a blocked road, a division on the move, and visibility near zero, Mason didn't ask. He rolled out his P-47, loaded smoke pods he wasn't authorized to carry, and lifted into the storm. Not for orders, not for glory, but for a promise written in pencil and sealed in blood. If you fly low again, make it count. July 12th, 1944, Wichita Falls, Texas. The Mason brothers stood side by side in front of the grain silo where they used to play war with sticks and boots too big for their feet. Alan was always the loud one, the kind who'd draw battle lines in the dirt and give every neighborhood kid a rank. Lyle just watched, listened, calculated. One day, Alan had turned to him and said, "You're not the fighter, Lyle. You're the trap setter." That was the first time Lyle smiled like he meant it. Alan enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, joined the infantry, went to Italy, fought like hell, wrote letters full of fire and dirt and strange names. Lyle waited 1 year, then joined the Army Air Forces. He didn't want to shoot Germans. He wanted to understand them, how they moved, how they thought. In France, Alan's unit was pinned during a retreat. No air support came. The smoke markers were blown off course. Artillery didn't see them in time. Alan didn't make it. The report said he died, shielding 2 younger soldiers, both of whom survived. Lyle read the letter twice, then again, then burned it. He changed after that. Not out of anger, out of resolve. He started flying low, not just for recon, but for patterns. He'd trace the shape of columns, not just the units. He memorized road widths, choke points, wind behavior through valleys. One night, his crew found him building a model battlefield out of cardboard and engine grease. "What the hell is that?" "A smoke trap," he replied. They laughed. He didn't. He became obsessed. Not with destruction, but with disruption. He wasn't trying to kill Germans. He wanted them to see the wrong thing, at the wrong time, in the wrong place. That's when mistakes happened. That's when the trap closed. So when the radio crackled that cold December morning, word of a German armored column forming near Hürtgen, and every flight officer said it was suicide to take off. Mason didn't wait. He grabbed the notebook from his boot. Opened to a page marked Choke Point, L-47. There, a drawing, a curved road flanked by pine trees, and 3 words scribbled in red. "This is where they'll be." He was right, and as he dropped the first pod of smoke, he thought not of strategy, not of glory, but of Alan, of that grain silo, of the dirt war with sticks and dreams, and of a promise made when war was still pretend. "You're the trap setter." Back to December 16th, 1944, 07:05 a.m. Near the ruined convoy, Western Clearing, Colonel Dietrich Klempt stood alone. Smoke still rolled low across the frozen road like a blanket trying to smother truth. The fog had thinned just enough to see the shape of their failure. Panzers stranded nose to tail, trucks burned out from within, and engineers huddled against trees like children caught in a storm they were told would never come. The silence was worse than artillery, worse than loss, because this wasn't defeat by force. This was humiliation by design. He looked down at his boots, splattered with slush, oil, and soot. Earlier that morning, he had mocked American pilots. They won't fly in this. And yet, someone had. One. Just one. And the chaos that followed had nothing to do with bombs. Only with blindness. At the far end of the clearing, a young radio technician sat with his helmet off. Face blank, hands shaking. He was whispering the same phrase over and over. We never saw him, but he saw us. In the sky above, Mason finally turned east. Fuel was gone. His mission was over. Below, the battlefield he left behind wasn't burning. It was unraveling. He looked over his shoulder once. The smoke still drifted, soft, weightless, endless. A kind of funeral shroud. He thought of Alan, of the letter, of the boys who never got to leave. And then he smiled. Back in the German CP, Klempt lowered himself into a folding chair. No one spoke. A junior officer entered, holding another phosphorus canister fragment. Klempt waved it away. Then slowly, almost to himself, he said, "They didn't need to kill us to beat us." A beat. Then again, softer. They just had to make us doubt our own eyes. The fog had lifted, but the damage was done. Not to equipment, not to the line, but to belief. Earlier that morning, they laughed at the weather, mocked American air power, trusted in fog as cover. Now, that same fog meant fear. That same sky meant traps. That same silence meant one thing. He could come back. December 17th, 1944, Allied Forward Command, near Monschau. The map table was covered in black grease pencil markings, lines that 48 hours ago had formed a grim pattern. German armor, tight formations, pushing west. Now those same lines sagged, fractured, vanished. Major General Clarence Hubner leaned over the map, brow furrowed, as reports came in one after another. Uncoordinated retreat observed along Route L-47. Panzer columns stalled without contact. Enemy radio silence continues, unknown if tactical or total. He turned to his aide. What happened to that division? The aide hesitated, then handed him a torn piece of yellow notepad, scrawled in pencil. Ghostwriter ran smoke. Grid blacked out. Germans never recovered. At the bottom, a signature. Lieutenant L.D. Mason. Elsewhere, on the outskirts of the Hurtgen sector, snow fell again. Among the wreckage of a broken convoy, a German infantryman trudged alone. No rifle, no helmet. Just a tattered scarf and a 1,000-yard stare. He passed 3 abandoned trucks, a tank half submerged in ditch water, and the body of a sergeant still clutching a useless flare gun. In his coat pocket was a letter, half burned, from his fiancée back in Munich. She had written, "I hope the sky is clear for you." He looked up now. It wasn't. It never would be again. Captured German diary, recovered weeks later by U.S. troops. There was no explosion, no thunder, only smoke, thick and alive. We stopped to wait for orders, but none came. Then we turned, and there was nothing to see. The forest was gone. The road was gone. We couldn't move, because we couldn't trust our own direction. For the first time in the war, I felt like a child again, punished, without knowing what I'd done. The American did not strike. He removed our vision, and in doing so, removed our will. In a tent near the front, Mason sat on a crate beside his grounded P-47. He had slept maybe an hour. No ceremony, no commendation. But someone had left a box on his cot. Inside was a folded American flag and a note. To the man who fought without firing, you blinded them. You saved us. 99th Infantry, 2nd Battalion survivors. He closed the lid. Didn't speak. just nodded once. Back in Berlin, the High Command scrambled to make sense of the loss. Official communiques blamed the fog, blamed the roads, blamed poor coordination. But in hushed rooms, staff officers whispered of a new Allied tactic, a psychological maneuver more terrifying than any bomb. One asked, was it a new weapon? Another replied, no, just smoke, and the will to use it where it would hurt most, inside the mind. By January, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division had been withdrawn, not because they were destroyed, but because they no longer trusted each other. Maps meant nothing, orders were questioned. And every morning fog brought fresh fear. The Americans didn't destroy them, they unraveled them, one plume at a time. March 1964, Little Rock, Arkansas. The man stood quietly at the edge of the gravel driveway, suitcase in hand, gray at the temples, his overcoat still dusted from a long bus ride. He looked out across the small farmhouse. Simple, red brick, a porch swing, wind chimes tinkling in the spring breeze. It had taken him 19 years to get here. He stepped forward, opened the gate, and walked up the steps. Then, gently, placed a sealed envelope on the wooden porch rail. No knock, no doorbell, just silence, and a nod to no one in particular. Then he turned and left. Inside the envelope was a note, handwritten, in German. I was there, in the fog, in the trap you built with nothing but smoke. I never forgot it, not because I was wounded, but because I wasn't. You made me live to see what I had become. A soldier chasing shadows, blind not from war, but from my own arrogance. I came to say this, in the language of men who understand regret. Thank you. You saved lives that day, and not just American ones. D. Klempt, former colonel, 26th Volksgrenadier Division. Lyle Mason never responded, but his wife would later say she found him on the porch that evening, sitting still, staring out at the cornfield beyond the fence, a distant look in his eyes. He didn't talk much about the war, never hung his medals, never called himself a hero. But every year on December 16th, he'd take a drive, alone, out past the river, onto an old airstrip long since abandoned, and he'd sit on the hood of his truck, watching the sky. Because that's what men like Mason understood. Victory wasn't always loud. It didn't always come with parades or headlines. Sometimes it came in silence, in hesitation, in one enemy soldier dropping his weapon, not because he was outgunned, but because he didn't know which way to run. They had mocked American airmen for being grounded, for being cautious, for waiting on the weather. But in the end, it was one of them who flew anyway, alone, with no weapons, no backup, just a promise and a pencil sketch of where he believed the enemy would be. And in doing so, he turned smoke, the one thing both sides feared, into the most effective weapon of the war. Not for destruction, but for transformation. Because when you take away a man's vision, you show him something deeper, who he really is when the fog lifts. What would you have done if you were him?